Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. In this video, I will talk about the geopolitics of India. It will be the fifth video of the series titled Geography and Power, where I describe the strengths and the weaknesses of the largest civilization alive today. If there is a word which truly characterizes India, it's the word extreme. On a territory 1/3 the size of China, India is a federal state composed of 29 states and 7 territories. Its population of 1.42 billion people belongs to many races and is divided into 3,000 castes and 25,000 hereditary subcastes that practice a multitude of religions. Over 1,000 languages and dialects are spoken in India, including 23 official languages, one of which is English. The Indian population, which is nowadays larger than the Chinese population, keeps growing and has never ceased to be a demographic powerhouse since antiquity. Already in the 5th century before Christ, Herodotus wrote that India was the most populous country in the world. It's true that Herodotus knew very little about China. In 2024, India had the 5th largest GDP of the world. On top of having a highly developed agricultural sector that feeds its immense population, the country is also home to 300 million cattle and 50 million free-roaming monkeys, not to mention vast healthy natural forests inhabited by large wild animals that require vast territories to survive, such as 27,000 elephants and 3,200 tigers. In India, sounds, smells, colors, pollution, architecture, art forms, and religious manifestations coexist without truly blending, which created the most complex civilization one can imagine. In India, the climate is so hot and humid that some natural phenomenon must accumulate a lot of energy in a country that has thrived so efficiently for so many centuries. Of course, India is a tropical country, but there is also the fact that in the north lies the Himalayas, the highest mountain range of the world. The Himalayas, which are covered in snow and glaciers, separate two very different worlds. South of the Himalayas, heat and humidity prevail, while to the north lie a desert and the sparsely populated cold steppes of northern Asia. This climatic contrast is due to the Himalayas' heights, which prevent heat, clouds, and rain from escaping northward. Geologically, the Himalayas were formed by the movement of the Indian tectonic plate, which separated from southern Africa about 100 million years ago and drifted northward until colliding with Asia, creating the immense uplift known as the Himalayas. The 3 great rivers of the Indian subcontinent, namely the Indus, the Ganges, and the Brahmaputra, all begin in the Himalayas and flow through the Indo-Gangetic plain, which is made fertile by the sediments carried down the mountains. The annual monsoon, which brings a lot of rain from the Indian Ocean, only increases the humidity of the Indian climates, sometimes causing severe natural disasters. The wild contrast between the southern flank of the Himalayas, where many rich agricultural societies developed in the past, and the poverty produced by the cold desert lying north of the Himalayas has shaped the history, the demography, and the cultures of India. Since prehistoric times, various horse-riding nomads or semi-nomads have used the northern mountain passes of the Himalayas to attack and plunder the Indian sedentary societies. The most famous of those passes was the Khyber Pass, located at the modern border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. If those invasions were so often successful, it was because the invaders had horses, an animal that cannot thrive in the sweltering Indian climate. After some millennia, that north-south migration gradually altered the physical appearance of the Indian population by displacing toward the east and the south the dark-skinned population that originally inhabited the entire Indian subcontinent at the time of the Aryan invasions around 1500 before Christ. In India, the further south and east you go, the darker the population skin tone is. This is also true when descending from the upper castes towards the lowest castes. This physical modification was produced by the caste system imposed by the Aryan invaders to the population they had conquered. This is obvious nowadays when we consider the so-called untouchables, who normally have a darker skin tone than the rest of the population. Since most Indians believe in reincarnation, the vast majority of them believe that poor individuals pay for the sins they committed in past lives. For them, the unfortunate are directly responsible for their miserable condition. It may seem strange, but that's the way it is. Given the extreme poverty in which India's untouchables still live today, it's clear that untouchability has led to higher mortality rates among dark-skinned Indians. It's not noteworthy that the Sanskrit word for caste is varna, which means physical appearance. If the vocabulary concerning the Aryans, the racial discrimination, and the upper castes coming from the north sound familiar to the Westerners, especially since the Nazi era, it is because Adolf Hitler drew much of his ideology from the Indian mythology. He even borrowed the swastika symbol from India, where it can be found on multiple temple facades. Historically, the north-south migrations of invaders into India has clearly been slowed down by geographical obstacles such as the Deccan Plateau and the rivers which flow in an east-west direction on that plateau. Such a geography always hindered the progress of an invading army or culture. This explained why the Indo-European languages dominate the Indo-Gangetic Plain today, while Dravidian languages prevail in southern India. The past displacement of the Dravidian populations towards the south is obvious when we consider the groups who, in northern India, keep speaking some of their languages. It's important to mention that the displacement of population we are talking about implies no cultural inferiority, since the Dravidians always produced a large proportion of the Indian elites. Already in the 3rd millennium before Christ, which means before the Indo-European invasions, the wealthy Indus Valley civilization maintained regular maritime trade with Sumer, a Middle Eastern kingdom whose founders and language likely came from the east. After the Indo-European invasions, The Dravidians, who were protected by the Deccan, turned their attention towards the Indian Ocean and started to trade with the regions we now call Indonesia and Indochina, two regions that have been heavily influenced by India and China. Attacked for millennia by raiders coming from the northwest, the sedentary and agricultural populations of India got used, after each defeat, to pay taxes to the invaders in order to be able to work in peace. Little by little, the Indians developed a very tolerant and pacifist society which created peace-loving religions like Buddhism or Jainism. The worst catastrophe of the Indian history was undoubtedly the Muslim conquest, which took place between the 11th and the 15th century, when Turkish tribes descending from Central Asia attacked India. It's interesting to note that those Turkish invaders did not use their own language, or Arabic, to administer their empire, but the Persian language, which has always been a much more sophisticated language. Islam, the religion of the Turkish invaders, however, spread successfully in the Indo-Gangetic plain, where today it completely dominates the territories of modern-day Pakistan and Bangladesh. If, during the Muslim occupation, the rest of the Indo-Gangetic plain remained in Hindu hands, it was mainly because Muslims were born merchants who preferred to settle near the mouth of the three great Indian rivers in order to control the extremely prosperous international trade taking place between the Indian Ocean and the rest of the world. At that time, spices such as pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves were in high demand in Europe, where the populations used them to flavor food in an era without refrigerators. Then, Muslim merchants used to say that the three strategic straits through which those spices had to pass to reach Europe or Asia, namely Malacca, Hormuz, and the Bab-el-Mandeb, were the three keys that opened the world's treasure chest. In the 15th century, this international trade was so profitable and the price of spices in Europe was so high that the kings of a country oriented towards the Atlantic Ocean, like Portugal, came up with the idea of seeking an autonomous route to the spice-producing countries by attempting to sail around Africa. As everybody knows, the Portuguese ultimately succeeded, which allowed them to use the firearms and the advanced deep-sea ships developed in Europe to take control of the strategic straits of Malacca, Hormuz, and the Bab-el-Mandeb. During the following centuries, the Muslims would never be able to reclaim control of the Indian Ocean from the Westerners. For the first time in history, India would suffer a massive invasion coming from the sea. The Portugal success would have enormous geopolitical consequences. First, the spice trade was now controlled by Europeans. Secondly, the primary source of wealth of the Muslim states disappeared, and Islam entered in a long period of decline. In Europe, Italy, which played an important role in the spice trade across the Mediterranean Sea, started a long decline, while the rest of the continent started to focus on the Atlantic Ocean. Spain launched the colonization of the Americas and of the Philippines. Finally, the Dutch, the French, and the English, who were better organized and far more numerous than the Portuguese, eventually replaced them in Asia and India. Since England was a purely maritime power, it used the European wars to weaken its European competitors one by one in order to establish its dominance over the Indian Ocean. To protect and increase the immense profits they made in India, the British were soon compelled to intervene in the internal politics of the Indian subcontinent until gaining a complete control of it. To secure the northwest frontier of their new empire, the British were finally forced to seize the control of the Khyber Pass in 1879. To make their colony ever more profitable, the British decided to reorganize the peninsula by giving it a central administration and modern means of communication like railways, ports, and roads. That modernization would unify the country and provoke the political awakening of its populations. Historically, the total British domination of the Indian peninsula would last only 200 years, from 1757 to 1947. When, after the Second World War, the British realized they were no longer a superpower, they decided to grant independence to India. However, true to their imperial policy of divide and rule, they weakened the subcontinent by granting independence to the two territories with Muslim majorities that we now call Pakistan and Bangladesh. This artificial division of the subcontinent along religious lines, which was done hastily, had a major geopolitical consequence since the three great rivers of the Indian peninsula ended up in Pakistan and Bangladesh, which weakened India and prevented it from becoming a major maritime power. Worse, the Indian subcontinent is now the scene of a latent conflict between two nuclear-armed nations that deeply despise each other. It should be noted that while Westerners, starting with the British, organized and equipped India to maximize its exploitation, they never sought, as the Muslims did, to massacre millions of its inhabitants or forcibly convert them to their religions. The British even left the country without fighting in 1947. As a result, modern Indians are grateful to the British for unifying the country and, above all, for liberating them from the rule of their former Muslim oppressors. This is why they have retained so many cultural elements from Great Britain, such as a British-style democracy, Western sciences, universities, and even the English language, which in India serves as a neutral means of communication. Before discussing the future of India, I would like to thank you in advance for liking my video, for recommending it to your friends, or to subscribe to my channel. This is very important for the dissemination of my videos. If you want to learn more about geopolitics, you can also watch my other YouTube videos on the subject, or read my books, which are available on Amazon. Now, let's go back to India, and we will begin by talking about the internal problems of the country. Given its economic and demographic growth, modern India, which produces 1.5 million engineers each year, should logically become an industrial superpower within a few decades. Unfortunately, this promising future could be threatened by some fundamental internal problems such as corruption, which seems impossible to eradicate. There is also the issue of pollution, since India is one of the most polluted countries of the world, a problem which will make almost impossible to achieve a vigorous industrial growth like the one experienced by China since 1980. India has extremely serious sanitation problems, particularly in the Ganges River that supplies water to 40% of the population of India. The Ganges is the sacred river where 1 billion Hindus would like someday to immerse themselves in its waters, despite the fact that those waters are supposedly more contaminated than the water flowing in many Western sewers. Nowadays, the Ganges is used as an open sewer by hundreds of millions of people who dump all kinds of waste in it, including countless poorly cremated corpses that can often be seen floating downstream. The sanitary situation is so dire in the region that the deadliest pandemics of the future are likely to break out along its bank, with consequences far more catastrophic than the Spanish flu of 1918. Without modern medicine, such a disaster would have already occurred long ago. If those problems could maintain India in a poverty that would impede it to compete against the other superpowers of the world, the country would still possess significant strategic advantages. For instance, India is the only country in the world that has given its name to an ocean. If it's like that, it's because India is located near the center of the Indian Ocean. Moreover, the peninsula is also located near the center of what geopoliticians call the world island, which is the supercontinent regrouping Asia, Europe, and Africa. India is also close to the Suez Canal, which leads to the European markets, near the Persian Gulf, where the Middle Eastern petroleum is produced, and near the Strait of Malacca, through which East Asian countries' ships must pass to accept Africa's raw materials. India is also much closer to Africa than Far Eastern countries like Japan or China. Unfortunately, India has also significant geopolitical weaknesses. For example, the country cannot become a major maritime power since most of its population lives inland. This is obvious when we look at the nighttime satellite image of India. To become a maritime power, India would need to follow China's example and relocate a large proportion of its population to coastal areas, which seems impossible since the country has a relatively short coastline with very few good natural coastal harbors. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, the three main rivers of the Indian peninsula all flow into Pakistan and Bangladesh. In other words, India lacks the coastal space needed to emulate China. Compared to Europe, which is a maritime power, it is clear that despite its central position in the Indian Ocean, India does not have, like Europe, a complicated coastline with many long and calm rivers that flow into the sea. Now, let's see who are India's natural enemies. To begin with, India has territorial disputes with several of its neighbors. Among them, the most aggressive are Pakistan and China. Pakistan is by far the most threatening since it still claims Indian regions with Muslim majorities such as Jammu and Kashmir. On the Indian side, the Hindus harbor bitter resentment and anger over the contempt and the violence inflicted upon them by the Muslims during the long centuries of Islamic rule in India. Since most of the past invaders of India came from the northwest, the Indian population never stopped looking towards Pakistan with caution. That caution is largely justified since India has one of the largest Muslim populations of the world. To paraphrase Chiang Kai-shek, who once compared the Japanese invasion of China to the communism of Mao Zedong, for India, China is a skin disease, whereas Islam is a heart disease. Despite their rancor against the Muslims, it's unlikely that the Indians will ever seek revenge against the Pakistanis, at least if the Pakistanis don't attack them. Why is it like that? It's because the diversity and the complexity of the Indian society have always paralyzed their leaders. Like China in East Asia, agricultural India in 5,000 years of history never tried to protect itself by invading Central Asia, for example. If its civilization, philosophies, and religions have spread in all directions, it has always been through merchants or peaceful travelers. It's important to note that it is not Islam, but rather the northwest mountain passes that are the true cause of India's instinctive fear of invasions. After all, Indians hardly fear the Muslims living in Bangladesh. Strategically speaking, Bangladesh is oriented towards the Indian Ocean and has always been a peaceful neighbor. In fact, Bangladesh has been one of the first countries to sign the international treaty banning nuclear weapons. In the case of China, its long-standing strategy towards India since the 1960s has been to encircle it by forming a highly developed alliance with Pakistan that included a military and nuclear cooperation. Logically, India and China should have peaceful relations as the two countries naturally turned their backs on each other and focused on entirely different directions. India looking towards the northwest and China looking towards the Pacific Ocean. This geographical separation is, of course, due to the immense natural barrier of the Himalayas. Yet, despite this, modern China has been increasingly aggressive towards India because its leaders know that sooner or later their national interests will inevitably clash both in the Indian Ocean and in Central Asia. Since India is a natural aircraft carrier positioned along both the maritime and the continental Silk Road China is developing, a complex web of alliance and counter-alliances is emerging in Asia. In recent decades, China has attacked India multiple times. However, its leaders made the mistake of attacking far from their main industrial centers and on the Indian side of the Himalayas, an error that a strategic expert like Carl von Clausewitz condemned in Napoleon's time, arguing that a state should never waste its energy by crossing uselessly a major mountain range like the Himalayas. If, in the future, India will be able to threaten China's Silk Roads with its air force, its strategic advantage over China will be even more important when space weapons will have become operational. This is due to two key factors. First, because southern India is near the equator, which will allow its rocket to benefit from the Earth's rotational momentum. Second, because southern India is located near the point on the planet where the gravitational force is the weakest. To summarize what we just said, India will never be a major maritime power except on the Indian Ocean, where it holds a dominant position. Otherwise, it will remain a continental power which will continue to be inward-looking. In particular, it will keep looking away from the Indian Ocean. Given its massive population, its deep-rooted pacifism, and its de facto control of the Indian Ocean and its choke points, the geopolitical role of India during the 21st century will be to stabilize the entire southern flank of Asia. India's main interest will then be to maintain a regional balance between an aggressive Islam, a declining Russia, and a China desperately trying to break its isolation on the western shore of the Pacific Ocean. In practice, India's essential interest in the future will align closely with those of the United States, which will remain the only maritime superpower with an easy access to all the oceans of the world. But that, as Kipling said, is another story. In the next video of this series, I will talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of the Islamic civilization. If you want to learn more about geopolitics, you can watch my other videos on the subject or read my books, which are available on Amazon. See you next time.